When my daughter-in-law told me to leave the house, I smiled instead of crying, and even now, when I close my eyes and go back to that moment, I still feel how strange that smile was, how unfamiliar it felt on my own face, because I had imagined many endings in my mind over the years but never this one, never a moment where my heart would be breaking so quietly that even tears would refuse to come. It was not a big smile, not something brave or proud, not the kind of smile people use to hide strength. It was small and trembling, almost invisible, the kind that appears when the soul is too tired to fight and too full to explain itself, the kind that surprises even the person wearing it, because it comes not from joy but from a deep, silent understanding that something has finally ended. She stood there in the doorway, my daughter-in-law, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if she were holding herself steady, her chin slightly raised, her eyes sharp and steady, eyes that told me she had practiced this moment many times in her thoughts, replaying it until she was sure she would not feel guilty when the words finally left her mouth. Behind her stood my son, my only child, my whole world once upon a time, standing just a step back, not beside me, not in front of her, but somewhere in between, pretending to be busy with his phone, pretending to read something important, pretending not to hear the sound of his mother's heart cracking open in front of him. The room felt heavy, like the air itself had stopped moving, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, so controlled that it hurt more than anger ever could, because anger would have meant emotion, and emotion would have meant she still cared. "You can't stay here anymore," she said, as if she were discussing the weather or the time of day, as if she were not erasing my place in the very house where I had spent years waking before dawn, cooking meals, whispering prayers, and waiting for my son to come home safely. For a moment, I felt something rise in my chest, a sharp pain that begged me to cry, to shout, to ask why, to remind them of everything I had given, but instead I nodded slowly, as if my body understood before my heart could protest, and that quiet smile returned to my lips, confusing everyone in the room, confusing even me. They looked at me as if they were waiting for a reaction they could manage, tears they could dismiss, anger they could justify, but my silence and my smile left them unsure, because they thought I was weak, they thought I had nothing left, they thought I was smiling because I had finally accepted defeat and understood my place, small and disposable, in their lives. What they did not know, what none of them could imagine in that moment, was that my smile was not surrender, it was not forgiveness, and it was not approval, it was memory rising gently inside me, memory of long nights when I held my son as he slept, memory of sacrifices no one ever thanked me for, memory of a younger version of myself who had survived far worse than this, and alongside that memory was patience, a patience built over years of being ignored, interrupted, and slowly pushed aside. A patience that had taught me that not every ending needs noise, because destiny does not announce itself loudly, it waits quietly for the right moment to turn the page. I bent down and picked up my small bag from beside the sofa, the same sofa I had saved for years to buy, counting coins, skipping comforts, telling myself that one day my family would sit together on it and feel at home, and as I walked past the framed family photos on the wall, photos of birthdays, weddings, smiles that now felt like stories from another life, I did not touch a single frame, because I knew if I did, my strength would shatter, and I would finally cry in a way I might never recover from. The house felt unfamiliar as I moved through it, like a place that had already decided to forget me, and when I reached the door, I turned back just once, not to accuse, not to beg, but simply because a part of me needed to say goodbye properly. "I'll be fine," I said softly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me, because somewhere deep inside, I had already accepted that fine does not always mean happy, sometimes it just means alive and moving forward. My daughter-in-law nodded slowly, her lips pressed together in satisfaction, like a queen who believed she had finally won her throne, and my son did not look up at all, not even once, not to meet my eyes, not to stop me, not to say a single word, and in that silence, I understood something that changed me forever, that sometimes the deepest wounds are not caused by cruel words, but by the absence of any words at all. There was a time when this house echoed with laughter, and when I say laughter, I do not mean the loud kind that fills walls and spills into neighbors' homes, but the soft, gentle kind that lives quietly between people who feel safe with one another, the kind that rises from shared mornings and settles into peaceful nights. In those days, the house would wake up slowly, just like me, with the sound of water boiling for tea, the faint call of birds outside the window, and my son's footsteps moving from one room to another as he prepared for his day. Evenings were calmer, filled with prayers whispered under our breath, warm food on the table, and small conversations that did not seem important at the time but now feel priceless to remember, because they made ordinary days feel full, complete, and alive. This house was not built only with cement and bricks, it was built with years of patience, sacrifice, and hope, and every wall carried a part of my story, a story that began when I became a mother and a widow at the same time. I raised my son alone after his father passed away, and the loneliness of that responsibility settled into my bones in a way words can never fully explain. There was no one to share decisions with, no one to lean on when money was short or fear kept me awake at night, and yet every morning I woke up with one purpose: to make sure my child never felt the emptiness I carried inside. I worked whenever I could, doing small jobs, saving every coin carefully, worrying constantly about the future, and praying more than I ever had before, because prayer became my only place of rest. Every brick of this house carried my silent struggle, the days I skipped meals so he could eat well, the nights I stayed awake listening for his breathing, afraid that if I slept too deeply, something terrible might happen. Every corner held a memory, from the doorway where I waited for him to come home safely, to the kitchen where I learned how to stretch simple ingredients into warm meals, to the small room where I sat many nights counting money and tears together, telling myself that one day, all of this would be worth it. When my son grew older and told me he wanted to marry, my heart felt both heavy and hopeful at the same time. Heavy because I knew my role would change, hopeful because I believed that love would only grow, not divide us. When he brought his wife into our home, I welcomed her with an open heart, not because I felt I had to, but because I truly wanted to. I saw her as a daughter, not as someone who was replacing me, and I promised myself that I would make her feel safe, respected, and loved under this roof. I cooked her favorite meals even when my knees hurt and standing for long hours became painful, smiling through the discomfort because I wanted her to feel cared for. I gave her my room so she could feel comfortable, moving myself into a smaller space without complaint, because I remembered how important it is for a new bride to feel settled and secure. I told myself again and again, this is what mothers do: they step back so their children can step forward, they give without keeping count, and they trust that kindness will always return in some form. At first, she smiled back at me in a way that felt genuine and warm, and those early days filled me with quiet happiness. She called me Ami, a word that touched my heart deeply every time she said it, and she would ask me for recipes, standing beside me in the kitchen, watching carefully as I cooked, laughing softly when I corrected her mistakes. In the evenings, she would sit beside me, sometimes asking about my past, sometimes sharing small stories about her day, and I believed, truly believed, that we were building something beautiful together. My son seemed happy too, relaxed in a way I had not seen in years, and I took comfort in knowing that the home I had built with so much effort was now filled with new life and new possibilities. But life rarely changes all at once, it changes slowly, in ways that are easy to ignore if you want peace more than truth. Very slowly, almost quietly, that warmth began to fade, and at first, I blamed myself for imagining it. Her smiles became shorter, no longer reaching her eyes, and her greetings became delayed, as if speaking to me required effort. She stopped sitting beside me in the evenings, choosing instead to stay in her room, and when she did join us, her eyes seemed to move around the house differently, measuring things that had never been measured before: space, control, power, as if she were silently deciding what belonged to whom. I noticed small changes in the way she spoke, the way she corrected me in front of my son, the way she rearranged things without asking, and each time, I told myself not to overthink, not to create problems where none existed. And my son changed too, though not suddenly enough for me to confront it, only just enough that I noticed and then pretended not to. He spoke less, listened less, And when I talked, his attention often wandered elsewhere, to his phone, to the television, to anything that did not require him to meet my eyes. He no longer defended me when small disagreements arose, choosing silence instead, and I told myself he was simply tired, busy, adjusting to married life. I chose understanding over confrontation, because I believed that love meant patience, and patience meant enduring quietly. Looking back now, I see how those small changes were the beginning of everything that followed, but at the time, I held on to hope tightly, believing that families bend but do not break, and that the love I had poured into this home would somehow protect me when the ground beneath my feet began to shift. It started with small things, so small that if I had spoken about them out loud, people might have laughed and told me I was imagining problems, that I was being sensitive, that this was just how families change over time. At first, the kitchen became hers, not because she said it directly, but because my hands no longer felt welcome there the way they once had. She began rearranging cupboards, moving spices, changing where utensils were kept, and every time I reached for something by habit, she would gently correct me, smiling politely as she said, "If you don't mind, this is better," and I would nod, step back, and tell myself that it was our home now too, that sharing space meant adjusting. Slowly, I stopped cooking freely, waiting instead for permission or for moments when she was not around, because I did not want to create tension over something as simple as a meal. The living room became too noisy, not because there was shouting or chaos, but because my presence, my voice, my way of sitting quietly with prayer beads or the television on low volume somehow disturbed the balance she wanted, and she would suggest gently that I rest in my room instead, that it would be more comfortable for me there, and again I would nod, because peace mattered more than pride, and I had learned long ago that arguing over small spaces only makes them smaller. My habits, the same habits that had once been accepted and even appreciated, slowly became old-fashioned, spoken with a smile that carried more distance than respect. The way I folded clothes, the times I preferred to eat, the prayers I whispered aloud, all of it began to feel outdated in her eyes, and each comment, though soft, landed like a reminder that I no longer fit into the rhythm of the house the way I used to. She never raised her voice, never insulted me openly, but there was a quiet firmness in her words that made it clear there was no room for discussion. "If you don't mind," she would say, "but this is better," and I would nod again, swallowing the small ache that came with each adjustment, because I believed that keeping the peace was more important than holding on to my comfort. But peace is fragile when respect is missing, and I began to feel that fragility in ways that kept me awake at night. My son stopped sitting with me after dinner, a routine we had shared for years, where we would drink tea together and talk about nothing and everything. At first, he said he was tired, then he said he had work, then eventually he said nothing at all, simply disappearing into his room with his wife while I sat alone at the table, listening to the quiet hum of the house. He stopped asking about my day, stopped noticing when I was unwell or when I seemed quieter than usual, and when jokes crossed the line, when comments were made that hurt more than they were meant to, he no longer defended me, no longer laughed them away or changed the subject, he simply stayed silent, and that silence began to feel like agreement. I told myself again and again that this was normal, that sons grow up, that priorities change, that I should not expect the same closeness forever, but the truth was harder to ignore each day. I felt myself shrinking, choosing words carefully, walking softly through rooms that once felt like extensions of my own body. One evening, as I passed by their room, I heard her whisper, "She's always here," and those 3 words froze me in place, because they were not said with anger, but with frustration, as if my existence were an inconvenience she could no longer tolerate. In that moment, I understood that I was no longer seen as family, but as something fixed and unmoving, like furniture that had been there too long, like something temporary that had overstayed its welcome. That night, I did not sleep, not because of noise or discomfort, but because my thoughts refused to rest. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move slowly as the night passed, replaying every moment, every conversation, every compromise I had made, wondering where I had gone wrong. I thought about the years I spent building this home, the love I poured into it, the belief that kindness would protect me, and I asked myself the hardest question a mother can ask, a question that carried more pain than any argument ever could: when did I stop belonging in my own home, and how did it happen so quietly that no one noticed except me? The day she asked me to leave was not loud, and that is what made it unforgettable, because I had always imagined that if such a day ever came, it would arrive with shouting, with accusations thrown across the room, with tears spilling freely and words spoken in anger that could later be blamed on emotion. But this day arrived quietly, almost politely, slipping into the house like an unwelcome guest who did not knock, who did not announce themselves, who simply stood there and waited until you noticed they had already taken a seat. The morning had begun like any other, with familiar sounds and routines, and nothing in the air warned me that by evening, my place in this home would be questioned so calmly that I would not even recognize the moment as it happened. There was no argument, no raised voices bouncing off the walls, no tears falling dramatically to the floor, just words, calm and sharp, chosen carefully, spoken slowly, as if each one had been weighed beforehand to make sure it could not be misunderstood or challenged. We were standing in the living room when she said it, the same room where I had once sat rocking my son to sleep, the same room where family photos smiled down from the walls as silent witnesses to happier times. She did not look angry, she did not look guilty, she looked resolved, and that expression told me that this conversation had already taken place many times in her mind before it ever reached me. "It would be better if you stayed somewhere else," she said, her tone gentle enough to sound reasonable, but firm enough to leave no space for discussion. Then she added, almost as an explanation, "for everyone," as if she were including me in that everyone, as if this decision were somehow for my own good too. I remember the way those words hung in the air for a moment, heavy and uncomfortable, and how my heart seemed to pause, waiting for someone else to speak, waiting for my son to step forward, to question her, to soften the blow, to say anything at all. But my son stayed silent, and that silence was louder than any insult she could have spoken. It filled the room, pressed against my ears, and settled deep in my chest where it began to ache in a way I had never felt before. I turned my eyes toward him, hoping to catch even the smallest sign of hesitation or regret, but his face remained still, unreadable, as if he had chosen distance over involvement, as if silence were the safest place to hide. I looked at his face, the same face I once wiped tears from when he fell and scraped his knees, the same face I washed anxiously when he was sick as a child, the same hands I once held tightly while crossing busy roads, guiding him carefully through traffic, believing that my job as a mother was to protect him from harm. Seeing that familiar face now, unchanged in features but altered in expression, hurt more than I was prepared for, because it reminded me that love does not always grow in the same direction for everyone. In that moment, something inside me finally went quiet, not with the sound of breaking, but with the stillness of acceptance. It was as if a part of me that had been holding on tightly, hoping things would improve, hoping that patience would eventually be rewarded, finally loosened its grip and allowed reality to settle in. I did not feel anger rush through me, I did not feel the urge to defend myself or list all the sacrifices I had made. Instead there was a strange calm, a deep, steady quiet that surprised me with its strength. I realized then that I had already given enough, more than enough, and that begging to stay in a place where my presence caused discomfort would only cost me what little dignity I still held. I smiled, not because I was happy, and not because I agreed, but because crying would have given them power they did not deserve. Tears would have turned me into something pitiful in their eyes, something they could dismiss as emotional weakness, and I refused to offer that version of myself after everything I had endured. That smile was my shield, thin but steady, protecting what remained of my self-respect, and as it rested quietly on my lips, I felt the weight of years lift just enough for me to stand upright. I understood then that some turning points in life do not come with dramatic moments or loud declarations, they come quietly, wrapped in calm words and polite tones, and they change everything not by force, but by finality. I left that house with one bag, a small, warm bag that held only the bare necessities, a few clothes folded carefully, a pair of slippers, some old photographs I could not bring myself to leave behind, and yet as light as that bag was in my hands, what I carried inside me felt far heavier than anything fabric or leather could contain. I carried truth, the kind of truth that does not announce itself loudly but settles slowly in the heart, changing the way you see everything you once believed in. It was the truth that love does not always protect you, that loving someone deeply does not guarantee they will stand beside you when it matters most, and that sometimes the people you sacrifice the most for are the ones who forget those sacrifices first. It was the truth that patience, when stretched too far, is often mistaken for weakness, that quiet endurance can be misunderstood as permission to push harder, to take more, to erase someone gently without ever having to raise a voice. And it was the truth that destiny never rushes, never needs to prove itself in a single moment, but it also never forgets, never loses track of the balance it keeps quietly behind the scenes. As I stepped outside, the evening air touched my face in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if I had been holding my breath for years and had only just now remembered how to breathe again. It felt free, because there were no expectations pressing down on me in that moment, no rules about where I should sit or how quietly I should speak. It felt cold, because freedom often arrives without comfort, without warmth, without reassurance, and it asks you to stand on your own feet even when your legs feel unsteady. And it felt honest, because there was nothing left to pretend anymore, no smiles forced to keep peace, no silence chosen to avoid conflict, just the clear understanding that my life was about to change in ways I could not yet fully imagine. Behind me, the door closed with a soft sound, not a slam, not a dramatic final note, but a simple click that echoed louder in my heart than any argument ever could. That door had once represented safety, belonging, and the result of years of effort and prayer, and now it stood as a boundary I was no longer allowed to cross. I did not turn back again, because I knew that if I did, I might weaken, and I had already decided that this moment would not take more from me than it already had. I stood still for a few seconds, listening to the sounds of the street, the distant voices of people living their own lives, unaware that mine had just shifted so completely, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel everything at once without pushing it away. In front of me, life waited, not with promises or guarantees, but with open space, with uncertainty, and with the quiet possibility of something new. I did not know where I would sleep that night, how I would rebuild my routine, or what my days would look like without the structure I had known for so long, but there was a strange strength in that uncertainty, a reminder that as long as I was breathing, my story was not finished. I realized then that being forced to leave did not mean I had lost everything, it meant I was being given the chance to rediscover parts of myself that had been buried under years of compromise and silence. They thought they had won, thought that removing me from their space would solve their discomfort, would bring them the peace they believed I was disturbing, and perhaps, for a while, it would feel that way to them. But destiny has its own rhythm, its own sense of timing, and it does not respond to pride or cruelty with immediate consequences. Destiny waits, watches, and balances quietly, and as I took my first steps away from that house, I felt something settle inside me, a calm certainty that this ending was not the end they believed it to be. Destiny was not finished with me yet, and whatever lay ahead, whether it was hardship or healing, loneliness or unexpected kindness, I would meet it standing, carrying my truth with me, because destiny, patient and unforgetful, was only just beginning.